Hi, why don't we get started? Welcome. Welcome to the second in the series, education series webinars. This session is called Data Collection and Data Design. My name is Sherry Houck, and I am a research scientist with the New Mexico Sentencing Commission. Today, our presenter is Dr. John Courtney, Deputy Director of the New Mexico Legislative Finance Committee, who will talk about data collection and data design. The chat is off. However, you can submit questions into the Q&A box at the end of Dr. Courtney's presentation. Our agenda today is fairly straightforward. We have introductions followed by Dr. Courtney's presentation, and then we'll dive right into the Q&A and wrap things up with a closing remarks. So without further delay, let me introduce to you Dr. John Courtney, Deputy Director for the New Mexico Legislative Finance Committee. Thank you for joining us today, John.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. There I am.
There you are. I see you now.
Yeah.
So you must enjoy analyzing people's minds because you have advanced degrees in psychology.
Yeah, I think a couple things to that. Psychology really interested me when I was at UNM, getting my undergrad. It seemed like one of the last frontiers of mystery when it came to science. We still don't fully understand the human mind, human behavior, and yeah, for a kid that grew up liking to being that annoying kid asking why all the time, and really just liking solving problems, it really appealed to me. And initially I was interested in potentially doing some sort of counseling. I didn't even know that research was an option when it came to psychology, experimental psychology, and discovered that I think my third year at UNM. And then I got into a lab ran by Dr. Michael Dewar, who's no longer there, but he was a great mentor. And I was hooked. I was absolutely hooked, and the rest is history.
Well, how did you get so good at data design and evaluations?
It's been a bit of a circuitous route. When I was coming out of graduate school, I was applying for jobs and actually got a really great job working for the Air Force Research Lab as a contractor in San Antonio, Texas. And we were looking at solving problems for the warfighters that were in the field, particularly around using non-lethal means, non-lethal weapons to try to end situations. Also, the most interesting project I worked on there was trying to figure out why people were really good. Some people were really good at finding hidden bombs or improvised explosive devices, and trying to figure out why they were good at it. Is it a trainable skill? And we ended up building a really great training program and essentially potentially saving lives. And I mean, there's, when your work has that kind of impact, it's just incredibly rewarding. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun. That job included a bunch of travel too, and I was in my late 20s, early 30s while I was there. And I mean, we traveled all across the country to Europe, interviewing these guys coming right back from Iraq and Afghanistan. And it was really, really interesting time. Yeah. And then moved on to state government, and took a lot of those skills that I learned in doing quick turnaround applied research projects, and started using them first at CYFD, and then working for the legislature for the finance committee.
Great. Well, with a variety of program areas that the CJCCs can apply for grant money, there must be some basic data that these programs have in common that evaluators such as you look at and review. Are there common data points that you'll be discussing today?
Yeah, so I'll be talking about probably some data points that folks will say, oh yeah, that sounds familiar, but more so, I really want to take a step back today and talk about, you know, why we want to collect certain data points and how that can really drive um, not only your data collection but analysis. It's almost flipping things on its head a bit, right? Talking about why we should be collecting data before we actually start collecting data. So I think I've got an interesting talk lined up here, but of course I think that hopefully other folks think so too.
Yeah. How does your team measure the effectiveness of governmental agencies' activities? Is this done by analyzing the data that agencies need to collect for their program over a period of time?
So for those unfamiliar with the Legislative Finance Committee, we're a staff of about 40. We have a group of fiscal analysts that come up with a budget recommendation for agencies. Each analyst has a block of agencies. Many of you probably know Ellen Rabin, who has public safety, or Amanda, who has the courts. And then we have the other side of the shop, who are program evaluators. These are researchers. And we work within this framework called Legislating for Results. And it's basically a big continuous quality improvement process. And within that process comes a lot of different ways to see, to check in with agencies to see how they're performing. That includes performance measures, that includes in-depth research projects or program evaluations. And I lead that side of the house, program evaluations, the program evaluation shop. So we're often asking agencies for data, helping them analyze it in some cases. In cases where we're interested in a research question and data doesn't exist, we may be looking to create data either through survey, observation. One kind of forefront that maybe at the future of data collection has been social media. And a lot of researchers across the country are starting to use that as a data source. So just a lot of different methods with a lot of really smart, motivated people trying to, again, solve really important problems and determine, you know, where we need to dedicate more resources and dedicate those resources to programs and practices that work, that are proven to move the needle, whatever that needle might be in whatever policy area we're looking at.
Great, great. Well, I don't want to steal your thunder, so I'm going to ask my last question and we'll get right into your presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that you can go ahead and pick up.
Okay. Share. And what have I done? Let's see here. Slideshow. There we go. Does that look good, Sherry?
That is perfect.
All right. Okay. So am I good to go?
You are. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much. I like this little animation. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks for sharing your lunchtime. Here's an overview of what we'll be discussing this afternoon, starting off with a 50,000-foot view of the value and progress of research in public policy. You know, we'll be looking through the years, have a few thoughts on big data and how that's changed the game field, so to speak. We'll talk about the importance of why when it comes to data collection and analysis. And finally, we'll cover some important considerations, barriers, and solutions for data collection and analysis, including this concept of working with partners on being solutions focused, which has been a really, really good strategy and a really good tool for us at LFC. So I wanted to start off by talking about one of the big challenges that I faced coming in when I left that job at the Air Force I was talking about, and started working for the state of New Mexico. Early on in my career at the legislature, we were meeting with policymakers about using evidence to make informed decisions, also called evidence-based policymaking. In this approach, we look at programs inside and outside of the state, along with the evidence behind them, with the idea of funding what works. One of the lines we kept hearing in our conversations was, "That doesn't work here." Or often people would point towards this quote up on the screen now from Lew Wallace, Territorial Governor of New Mexico, author of Ben-Hur and contemporary of Billy the Kid. "Every calculation based on experience elsewhere fails in New Mexico." And to me, that meant a few things. People were thinking that data won't help and that New Mexico is unique in some way, where an evidence-based program, say in Colorado, had no chance here. And I'll say that over the past decade, the tide has turned both in New Mexico and nationally. I don't see this quote hung on the walls quite as much anymore. And there's been more optimism to taking a hard look at ourselves and others to determine how to best improve outcomes. I'll mention something quickly also, which is at the bottom of some of the slides. I'll have links to resources for more information if you want to dig deeper into anything we discuss. And so this one is a research article from Pew discussing New Mexico's approach, specifically the legislature's approach to evidence-based policymaking. So we're seeing an ever-growing use of data and empirical evidence in public policy, both in New Mexico and nationally. The graph on the left shows the percentage of public policy data-based articles in economic journals over the last, 20, 30 years. And you can see that those articles are taking up a larger proportion of what's published. Now in medicine, the link between research and decision-making, it's bold, it's clear. Whether we're developing a new surgical procedure or a COVID vaccine, let's say, decisions are heavily informed on research outcomes. With social science, the link has been less clear over the years. And you may have heard the metaphor used that science is like an onion, with the hard sciences at the center of the onion. Think physics. And the softer sciences kind of at the outer edges, with maybe sociology towards the edge. But we made progress in the social sciences, particularly in the application of that information in public policy and criminal justice, with researchers from Stanford publishing a paper last month saying that right now we're in the golden age of social science. And that's really exciting. And why is that? For one, we have better tools that help us move faster, help us see more. There are a lot of interesting examples of new analysis coming in from the private sector. We have more interdisciplinary teams working with unique perspectives. We have new and improved methods for examining research questions, including the use of randomized control trials, statistical modeling, and machine learning. So we're really making progress, and I like this idea of the golden age of social science. And in criminal justice, you can make a similar argument where, historically, researchers have said that there have been competing goals of what should be, how offenders should be treated. And that's really hampered research around, well, what should we be doing and what should we be examining? And the example that the authors that I cite here give is, historically there was an argument about should offenders be contained or should they be rehabilitated? And over the last, I'd say 20 years, according to Cullen and Johnson, we've really started rowing in the same direction, which again is exciting. That bottom left quadrant there, we've been talking about addressing root causes through prevention and early intervention, reducing incarceration for low risk offenders, reducing recidivism via programming. These concepts that I'm sure everybody who pays attention to criminal justice research, these concepts of justice reinvestment and reinvesting in things that work and evidence-based practices. And it's a really exciting time, where we're all rowing in the same direction, and hopefully we'll start to see dramatic improvements in outcomes. Throughout the presentation, I'll be asking you all to really be thinking deeply about what you want to achieve. What's your definition of success in your community when it comes to criminal justice? What are the goals that you can set to meet that success? And really starting from that from that point of view, before we even talk about what data we need to start collecting, can get you really far down the road and can help you avoid a lot of the common problems that you run into when you start with the what, so to speak. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. But one of the things that's really key when we're trying to make a difference, when we're trying to fix something, when we're trying to improve outcomes, is asking the right questions. So let's talk about an example of asking the right questions from World War II. During the war, the Allies were suffering really heavy losses to B-17s, and the brass set a goal of reducing our B-17 losses and increasing our survival rates. The folks tasked with solving this problem set a research question to meet that goal. Where were the returning bombers taking the most damage? A team collected those data from repair shops, and it's illustrated here on the slide, and they determined the bombers that were returning were taking the most damage on the outer and inner edge of the wings and the tail. The initial recommendation from the number crunchers was to reinforce those same areas to avoid those B-17s being shot down. But is that the right question? And spoiler alert, no, it's not. As it turns out, it wasn't the right question. And the proposed solution wouldn't have met our goals of reducing B-17 losses. Luckily for us, a pretty smart mathematician named Abraham Wald figured it out. He asked where were the holes in the bombers that weren't returning? The planes that didn't return were taking damage in the cockpit, the engines, and the fuel tanks. These missing holes, they're circled here, were the story. And by armoring those areas, mission survival rates increased by a factor of 10. All because somebody asked the right question. So don't worry, we're going to be talking about best practices in data collection. But I really want to get everybody thinking about getting prepared for data collection. And that process includes not only MOUs and addressing HIPAA and data quality checks, but also asking the right questions and defining a shared goal. So is it that easy, a goal and the right question? Of course not. You guys know this. It's never that easy. But luckily, we have some additional models of thought and research that can help to help in this area and help us better prepare. So think for a moment, again, back on how you define success. If you've ever watched my boss, Patty Lundstrom, who's going to be the incoming chair of Legislative Finance Committee, likely, and she's chair of House Appropriations and Finance Committee, she'll often ask, how do you define success at your agency? What are your goals to meet your definition of success? If you haven't done this, you should. Setting goals and creating a strategic plan can lead to improved performance. Setting goals can be particularly effective when the goal is both ambitious and made public. And I'm not making this up, this is research. On the right side of the slide here, you see a model on how to set a goal and ensure that you're making progress towards that goal. If you serve time in the military, this might look familiar. You might say, oh, this looks a lot like the OODA loop. If you've worked in private industry, it might look a lot like, continuous quality improvement model. Every discipline has a cyclical model like this aimed at setting a goal and making progress towards that goal by using data and informed action. This one is from Maryland Governor Martin O'Malley, who helped establish CompStat in Baltimore when he was mayor there, and helped set it up at the state. It's called StateStat as governor. It's an iterative model with 4 components: set a goal, build a habit of accountability, target action, and keep a scoreboard to see how you're doing. He's literally written the book on this, and there's a website down at the bottom of the slide here. You don't have to buy the book. I'm not trying to sell books for Governor O'Malley, but this website has a lot of great resources that I encourage you to look at, many of which are dedicated towards improving public safety and basically applying this idea in different realms. We'll just scratch the surface here today. When you're thinking about data collection and your research design, you're going to get further faster if this structure is in place. Once that goal is set, what data do you need to create a habit of accountability and keep a scoreboard? What benchmarks can you use to track your progress? Data from other states, from previous years, trend data, are things getting better, getting worse? To meet your goals, again, which are ideally ambitious and public, a system needs to create a habit of accountability and target actions. As each component is part of an iterative process, you'll need to monitor performance to determine how to improve results and determine if you're making progress towards your goal. Using performance measurement and management probably sounds familiar to those of you who know about CompStat. And it might sound familiar to you, those of you who work for a state agency and have to report performance metrics to the state, because we do something similar at the state level. That results for legislating for results framework that I mentioned, and performance-based budgeting. It's all based in this same idea. So building into the strategic planning, using those data on the programs that you have, the progress you're making in those programs, the effectiveness of those programs, and making sure that things are being run with fidelity. All of this should help you identify and take targeted actions. How are those actions working? For example, evaluations of programs you've stood up to meet your goals. The targeted actions will need to be evaluated as a part of keeping a scorecard to make sure each initiative is delivering the expected results. Are you moving the needle? And then back through the cycle. So throughout the presentation, I have a few case studies where we call this into action. So here's an example of where this process, part of it was in place, and we ended up filling in some of the blanks at the corrections department. In 2012, my staff conducted a program evaluation of the corrections department. And in that evaluation, we found that they had a goal of reducing recidivism through treating root causes. And the program that the most resources were being dedicated to that goal were prison-based therapeutic communities. Now, for those of you not familiar with TC, inmates live in a 24/7 pod or cell block with other participants. And those participants can earn increased social and personal responsibility as they progress through stages of treatment. There's lots of peer support, there's lots of peer accountability, and research shows that this should reduce recidivism by about 7%. Well, when we first started looking at this program, we discovered a few things. One, the department wasn't looking at how the program was being implemented. And when we compared implementation to best practice, we found a number of issues, including the program was too short. It was being run as a 6-month program, but best practice called for it to be run as a 12-month. It wasn't available at all prisons, which meant when a prisoner transferred from, say, Central to Southern, if the program wasn't in place at one of those prisons, they couldn't continue, and that contributed to a really low completion rate of about 18%. Also, best practice said that we should have aftercare services, which weren't happening. So, when we were looking at the inputs, it raised a few red flags for us. And one of the things we wanted to know was, well, what about performance? How are folks doing at return to prison or recidivism, which in this case was defined as return to prison within 36 months. And what we found was that recidivism rates for program participants were actually higher than non-participants. And this was particularly concerning because the participants in this program were relatively low risk. Folks that were living in bigger pods and likely had lower risk for violence and lower risk for recidivism. So in effect, the program wasn't reducing recidivism, and there's a possibility it might have been making things worse. So essentially, by using that process, we filled in some of the blanks that we discussed earlier. And ultimately, the corrections department revamped the program to a different approach from the federal government called Residential Drug Treatment Abuse Program, or RDAP. But that doesn't end the story, right? How is that program working? Is it being implemented with fidelity? Do we have performance metrics to say we want to reduce recidivism by 7% based on other research? Using that information and moving forward and keeping the cycle moving is really important. So let's pause to think about how you might define success. What are the needles you're trying to move? And at the bottom left of the slide, I have a few that I just threw up off the top of my head that I would guess might intersect with some of the needles that you all are trying to move. Here we see in the map that even from a trend standpoint over the last 10 years, there's some areas where the percent changes in crime has gotten a lot worse. There are areas where it's gotten a lot better. This isn't even looking at violent versus property crime. If we were to dig a level deeper, you might find property crime down, but violent crime up. And my point here is that there's likely not a one-size-fits-all approach. And this really does have to be a kind of an organizational, systemic, introspective approach. So now we're getting somewhere. And I hope you can see the value in asking the right questions. in defining success and goal setting, monitoring and planning. Next, we'll discuss data collection, finally, right? John's gonna stop talking about asking the right questions, including some thoughts on integrated data systems, important considerations for collection. We'll talk about a series of what I like to think of as data filters when you're starting out to do your data collection, and really important questions to ask as you're researching which data you might use. Before we jump into that, oh, and then we'll talk about barriers and again, working with partners towards being solutions focused. But before we jump in, I think it's worth mentioning this idea of the golden circle and the power of why. And there's a link to a really great TED Talk on this. And it kind of lines up with what we've been talking about. Why are some organizations and leaders able to get things done? A lot of times we're working from the outside of this circle in. We have the data. Maybe we have a really great tool. We have an integrated data system. We have metrics. You know, here's how we're going to collect those and use them, and we'll improve our outcomes. We often get weighed down in the what and the how, and we lose sight of the why. How many meetings have you been in where you spent way too long arguing about how we're going to define recidivism? What we need to measure is recidivism. How should we define it? We'll do it this way. We'll do it that way. And you know, during that time, we're losing sight of the why. This is where your definition of success and goal setting matters. Starting out with the why and then building out to the how and the what. This also gives you the opportunity to come back to the touchstone of your shared value of why if things start to go off the rails in your meetings. And I give kind of here's a goofy example for you guys. Why do I need a vehicle? Why do I need a vehicle? Well, my family really likes to go camping. It'll have to be something that has enough room for them, has to have the ability to pull a trailer and cruise control for like long trips. And so ultimately what I settle on is a Ford F-150, which that is what I drive. There's a picture of me setting up a tent with a rubber mallet, very excited to be there. And so we started off with the question of why here, right? Well, what would happen if I personally started off with the question of what? What do I want to drive? I will tell you what happened. What would happen? This didn't happen. I would end up with a Ford Mustang GT500. I guarantee it. I love that car. But that is not going to fill the needs of me or my family. All right. So let's talk about one of the big what's that I hear a lot from where I sit at the Legislative Finance Committee. And then we're going to jump into, I promise, the data collection filters and kind of best practices and really great questions to ask to make sure that the data that you're getting is going to be valid, reliable, and usable. So integrated data systems, putting everything into one bucket. For a long time, we have been hampered by technology. That's no longer true. There are a lot of great tools out there that can help us answer research questions and help us organize our data in a really great way. These are often called integrated data systems. You know, I know that you all have heard so many times this concept of data silos and how it's limiting to us. And absolutely, data silos can be an enormous challenge. But in my view, integrated data systems are starting with the what. And this idea of, well, if we put everything in one bucket, it's going to solve all of our problems. Integrated data systems are the GT 500 of research and data design. They can be really useful. They can also be really costly and resource intensive. There are often data solutions that don't require significant IT investment. And one of the things that we've learned from the Legislative Finance Committee, watching these things attempted to be built over the last decade or so, we have a really poor record with them. I list some best practices here on the right, and we have a really good FIR that we wrote in response to a request for an integrated data system that has a memo attached to the back of it that really dives deeply into this. And I'm not saying this to say, well, we shouldn't invest in integrated data systems. I think they're a great thing. And if we can get them up and running, outstanding. but don't lose sight of the why. Don't lose sight of what does success mean to me? What are my goals? On the bottom here, I have an example of from Florida where Florida passed this sweeping legislation that they received a ton of national attention for. And the idea was, again, we're going to put everything into one bucket. The collection of this data, your funding was based on whether or not you turned data in for the system. And it didn't take off right away. I mean, I'm still hopeful it'll get off the ground, but you can see here from the Florida Times Union, the press is declaring it as a failure. So let's assume that you've answered the why sufficiently and you're not hung up on the tools, so to speak. You've defined what success means. You've set up your goals, and now you need some data to fill in those blanks. How do we do that? We need to think steps ahead, including thinking about how we'll use those data for our analysis. Sometimes you can even have an analysis plan ready to go at this stage, or the how. So here are those data filters that I talked about. And now we're talking about data collection. So here are some important considerations for data collection and identification. Again, I think of these as a series of filters. They're not mutually exclusive. You know, they can happen kind of at the same time in some cases. First, your data census. What exists out there? Your resources here include not only interviews and examinations of systems, but examining requirements for data collection from local, state, and federal government. On that, a good tip is to see what data an agency is required to report to the federal government if they receive federal funding. There have been numerous examples where we've done research projects or program evaluations where folks at the agency didn't even know about some of the data that they were collecting because it was several layers down. And it was being used for the specific purpose to fill federal requirements. But it could also be used for analysis, benchmarking, to track how you're progressing towards a goal. Ask around, both within and outside of the agencies. Ask your criminal justice experts. My first stops when I'm doing a data census for criminal justice is Linda Freeman at the Sentencing Commission and Paul Guerin at ISR. These folks have wealths of information. And you'll also find the same is true of many people working within state agencies. The feds usually have pretty tight restrictions around data quality. And so when you're looking at federal data, integrity is often good, and these data are often useful. So what's out there, the data census? Data definitions. Take a moment and think about the categories that define race and ethnicity. Well, first, does the organization who have the data have a data dictionary defining variables and tables? That's a good thing just to ask for. And a lot of times agencies will have a data dictionary, and that can save a lot of time. And now I'll hop into that example. Think about the categories that define race and ethnicity. Like if I asked you to define what are categories of race, what would you say? What are categories of ethnicity? What would you say? If you haven't worked with those type of data before, you might be kind of throwing darts blindfolded. Even the definition of these two terms vary within the state. Sometimes the terms are used interchangeably. The definition we use at LFC is based on the definition from the federal OMB, also used by the Census Bureau, where ethnicity identifies a social definition and race identifies white, Black, American Indian, Asian, Native American, or Pacific Islander. Ethnicity defined as Hispanic or not Hispanic. One of the reasons that the definitions for this term differ, it's not that the social definition of race and ethnicity are set in stone. They're ever changing. And the link that I have down here on the resource is something from the Census Bureau that discusses that. Even now, there are calls at the federal level to change the definition more, which is what this link at the bottom of the page, that white paper talks about. It also talks about the history of those definitions. We obtained data some years back where race within the state where race was defined as nationality. My point here is not that some agencies are doing it wrong. my point is that if you're conducting research or collecting data to look at disproportionate representation, for example, you can start to see why defining your goals and really digging into these data definitions and getting everybody on the same page early is really important. Defining what you want to measure becomes essential at this point when you're just beginning your data collection. Third here, data history and quality. Are the data that exist valid and reliable, and has that changed over time? You can likely see the logic that we're using as we dig into these considerations. We discussed history, impacting race and ethnicity data, and learning about the history of data collection at an agency. It's really important. Are the data that you found measuring what you think they're measuring, and are they doing so in a consistent way? Meaning, are the elements reliable, and do they measure what they should measure? We often talk about these concepts in terms of research, validity and reliability, but they apply to observations as well. Often you'll find that due to differing practices in data entry, IT systems, or how things are defined, quality might vary. I can think of instances in the past where an agency described a point in time where they can point to data quality really improving. We got an IT upgrade in 2014. We had a team that went out and worked with our data entry folks in school districts, for example, in 2016. So this field's no good before that. But afterwards, yes, please do use it. You know, due to these considerations, some data may or may not be usable to your purposes. We've also seen examples of improvement in data quality due to new federal requirements. When you skip this step, what sometimes happens is the data just won't make sense, or you're dealing with a lot of missing cases at certain points in time, and you don't know why. You know, just because the data exists or those fields exist doesn't necessarily mean that you should be using them. Who remembers the HBO show The Wire? I love that show. I rewatched it again for a second time over the pandemic. Do you remember the term juking the stats? The idea that you can categorize or reclassify data with the goal of meeting certain goals or benchmark of turning things in the right direction. We've run into the same concept in our work. And, you know, within this, there are often tools that and tips that you can use to make sure that what you're measuring is actually what's happening. In that case, we learned a potential canary in the coal mine for violent crime is murder. Hard to disappear a body. For property crime, auto theft. Usually those get reported to insurance. And speaking to this, even assuming that crime is reported accurately, certain crimes do go underreported, but there are resources for what those proportions are. And that research can help you get to what the crime levels actually might be in those different categories. So again, just another example of some of the questions we need to be asking when we're looking through these filters, and some of the solutions that you could potentially use to work through some of the barriers you might run into. Okay, part 2, data sharing and security. Are the data you need available for sharing, and what protections need to be in place for use? Are your data subject to protection through state or federal law? Are there new laws to consider that passed through the legislature this year? I know that there are. And if you haven't looked it up, look at Senate Bill 75, I believe, did get through. And that may change some of the ways that we have to deal with certain data. Have you ensured that people who will be handling the data understand those laws? And that feeds into the methods and protections that you're going to need to put into place for transfer and storage. You know, you don't want to run right out and start getting data and asking for data and potentially jeopardize the security of sensitive or confidential information if you have protected information in there, personally identifiable information. You don't want to get your project or your program shut down because somebody emailed some PII that's protected by HIPAA or FERPA or other state law or federal law. There are multiple resources to train on data protections. I highly recommend that the person who will be responsible for those data that you're working with go through those trainings. You have the resources. This is another question to ask. Do you have the resources for the collection and the analysis that's needed? Is that going to be a recurring expense or a non-recurring expense? Are you going to have some startup costs? If you're writing a grant application, that consideration is particularly important. Data management. I kind of covered that just now. Data management. Do you have the resources you need to properly store and analyze these data? So again, hardware, software, and personnel. Cybersecurity is becoming more and more of an issue across the country. And having the right protections in place if you plan to put your data on a network and they have sensitive information is going to be extremely important. Or making the decision to keep those data off of a network and potentially de-identifying the data once you do share them. Again, a lot of good things written on this, a lot of best practices around HIPAA, around FERPA that I highly encourage everyone to check out. Data analysis and interpretation. Do you have an analysis plan for the data that your organization is capable of carrying out? If you have a proposal to do a hierarchical linear model, do you have somebody that knows about modeling or machine learning or randomized control trials? You want to be asking these questions and asking which data you'll need to answer those questions that you will have established in the process that we discussed earlier around goals, around defining success, performance measures, your empirical research into programs. Throughout this process, you want to be documenting also what you find through these filters. It's fine if you know that you can't use like race and ethnicity from, I'll make something up, the Embudo Police Department. I don't think that exists. Prior to 2014, because they weren't collecting that information that year. But you want to make sure that you have it documented so that, if you get a great job to go lead, I don't know, NIC or something, the person that comes after you knows those same considerations also. I also can't stress the importance, and I think I'll talk about this a bit, just a bit later, but I'll wrap up soon, of collecting qualitative information around those data systems also. And that's like an example of one piece of qualitative information, correct? What do the experts know about these data systems? What are the cases that or the variables that are really great and the variables that probably have quality issues? Once your data is in hand, there's some basic, what I call data sanity checks you should run before you even do your analysis or your benchmarking. An enormously valuable tool, and I can't stress this enough, is to plot your data on a graph. Plot your data on a graph. How does it look? Does it look how you expect it to look? Did you expect a normal distribution? Do you have one? Do you have outliers? Look at some of the basic frequencies to see if you have missing data, duplicate records, differences in how data are entered. What are your plans for issues when you run into them? If you do have missing records, if you do have a lot of outliers, what did your qualitative data collection, so those interviews with the keepers of those data, inform what you're seeing? Then it's on to analysis and benchmarking. And on that, I'll say something about making the statistics meaningful. So 3 components here from this writing that May did back in 2004 that I really like: understandability, interpretability, and comparability. How do you make the stats analysis you have meaningful? Making sure it's understandable, interpretable, and comparable. So for understandability, results should be reported in an easily understood form, assuming the audience knows little about stats. Folks aren't going to care about p-values. They may not care about your logistic regression outcomes. You really need to do a good job of interpreting those data to eliminate the jargon for your readers. Interpretability: consider how your data can be interpreted to reflect what and others defined as important. So for example, if you're trying to capture cost savings, instead of and you're presenting to a budget committee, instead of talking about changes in spending by total budget, a budget committee might be better informed by spending per inmate. And then comparability: can you make meaningful comparisons with your data using benchmarks from other studies, goals, previous trends, etc. So we're almost done. I wanted to wrap up by saying something on being solutions focused and bring it back to that recidivism debate. And to be clear, I'm defining recidivism here as using the U.S. Sentencing Commission's definition, refers to a person's relapse into criminal behavior, often after the person receives sanctions or undergoes intervention for a previous crime. Now, that's a pretty global definition, and it doesn't really bring in kind of two major components to a recidivism definition: the time frame and what event to use there. And I think back on, I use recidivism as an example because early on, when I came back to the state and I was working for COIFD, and we were at a juvenile justice meeting for the Juvenile Justice Service area. We spent the entire meeting talking about defining recidivism. And spoiler alert, we didn't arrive at a definition by the end of the meeting. And I'd bet $1 that some of you have had that same experience. And this goes back to that golden circle that I was talking about. What did we start with? We started with talking about the why, the what, and the how. And nobody really brought up the why. And this can keep your meeting from going off the rails. You know, even if you do need to dive in and have an argument about how you define recidivism, why are we measuring this? And what's really important to learn from measuring recidivism? And then putting some guardrails in place for that discussion and really bringing it back to being solutions focused. And I'll say this also when it comes to data collection and analysis. You're going to run into situations where people say, I can't share that with you for security reasons. I don't have the resources to share that with you. We're not staffed to that extent. Bringing it back to, you know, look, this is why this is important. And really getting to a shared value and a shared goal can help move those conversations along. And I can tell you through learning the hard way several times over the last decade, that using this strategy is so effective. And it's so much easier than trying to argue about, well, yes, you can because the law says X. Or, you know, well, yes, you can, I looked at your staffing resources. Really getting to that shared value of why is really valuable. So I want to leave some time for questions. We covered a lot, the value and progress of using research in public policy, particularly criminal justice. Again, that importance of asking the questions why and goal setting, data collection and analysis. You know, again, I hope I cited most of the resources at the bottom of the page. Feel free to dig in and go further into those areas. I can't stress enough the importance of starting off with what you're hoping to accomplish. And finally, I'll say, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And this is how I'll wrap up. That job that I was talking about that I had initially out of grad school working for the United States Air Force Research Lab as a contractor. One of the projects we worked on was trying to figure out why people were good at finding hidden bombs and training on that. And I developed a pretty neat experiment using signal detection theory to try to figure out why people were good at finding hidden bombs, roadside IEDs. And I went into my boss's office, Dr. Alan Ashworth, who brilliant scientist, and I said, I need another week to perfect this. And he turned around and he had a graph up on his computer behind him, and it showed the number of deaths from improvised explosive devices every month. And at the time, I want to say we were between 100 and 200 deaths. This was back in 2000. Gosh, this was a while ago. This was back in 2007, I would say. And he said, look, applied research, you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If we press the brakes on this for another week, it delays us rolling it out by a month. And we've got one more bar here when, you know, we need enough information to get these guys off the floor of chance, better than a guess. And so that's not to say, you know, don't do a good job using those filters, but it is to say that you can't hold things up to such an extent that you're potentially impacting outcomes in a negative way. And so I'll stop there. Thanks again. And I suppose, Sherry, we'll see if we have any questions with about 10 minutes left or so.
Yes, if anyone has any questions, I see one here in the Q&A. Will a recording of this presentation be available? Yes, we are recording. So we will hopefully get that up on our website. And You'll be able to view it whenever you would like. Any other questions? Oh, they would like to share your presentation with their entire division. That's great. It is good information. Very good.
Great, yeah, absolutely. And I think I've got my contact information on there too. Please feel free to email, call. We've done a lot of work across a number of criminal justice areas. Courts, police, prison, jail. So although, and it's an incredible amount to cover. One of the other approaches that I considered was, okay, we can just try to do one of those data filter components and dive in, and that could have taken easily an hour to try to do a data census of like what criminal justice data is available. But again, I'm a pretty good resource on that. Linda Freeman's a great resource on it. Paul Guerin's a good resource on it. If you're looking, within the courts, Artie Pepin, start there and go from there. So a lot of really great hardworking people, again, using data and research to answer important questions.
And John, would you send me your slides so that we can put those up on the website?
Absolutely. When I get off here, I will send them right over to you.
I think I do have them. You did send them prior.
Oh, good. Okay, good. Yeah.
Yes. Any other questions? I did, while we're waiting for more questions to come in, I did read the article on the Florida IDE and the platform they were trying to start up. And I think one of the overlapping or overarching problems was lack of uniformity with the data between agencies. And I think a lot of agencies struggle with definitions and uniformity.
Absolutely. And this is true of a lot of the policy areas that we work in at the LFC. Often we're working with data silos, and along those lines of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, you can't wait for the tool to be the solution. A good example of this is in the realm of early childhood research. We've done studies, or we've had research questions asking, how does childcare impact, high quality childcare impact certain outcomes for families in New Mexico? How does pre-K impact certain outcomes for families in New Mexico? Now, the state has invested in an integrated data system for early childhood. It's called, the acronym is the ESIDS. And there are a lot of really smart people working really hard on it, but it's not ready yet. And we've been working on it for, gosh, a really long time, years and years and years. But the answers to those questions can't wait. Lawmakers are just this session asking, hey, should we be opening up the permanent fund for early childhood? What are some of the outcomes that we would hope to see from that? And so our research group basically took these data silos, and we figured out a way to create a uniform identifier, a uniform, unique, common identifier among at least 3 different data silos. And we merged those data, talked with folks from other research organizations around best practices about doing that. And last year came out a report showing that participation in pre-K leads to improvement and corresponds with better high school graduation for the inaugural class back in 2006. And we were able to do some cost benefit analysis also showing that for every dollar you invest, you get about $6 back. That's not to the taxpayer. About $2 or $3 of that's to the taxpayer. About $2 or $3 of that is to the participant. Now, this isn't to say I'm endorsing a strategy of say opening up the permanent fund through HJR1, for example, but we have that piece of information now, and we didn't wait on a tool to get it. So, we can do the same thing in criminal justice, and we have done the same thing in criminal justice. You know, when we did the Bernalillo County crime report, I'm just going to share my screen real quick again, unless we have another question. I want to have one other thing to share here if we had time. When we were doing, a couple of years ago, my staff looked at the Bernalillo County criminal justice system. There were a few questions that came out of that. One was just what's happening across the system. Now, there's not one database where we can go to saying, well, we have this many crimes, we have this many arrests, we have this many indictments. What our team did is they went in a number of different data systems. You can see all the resources there under sources: APD, BCSO, the UNM Police Department, the Corrections Department, AOC, the Sentencing Commission. Linda Freeman and Paul Guerin were enormously helpful in helping us put this together. And what we found was that through 2014 to 2017, as reported crime increased, the criminal justice system didn't necessarily respond in kind. There were fewer arrests, there were fewer indictments, convictions remained relatively steady, but did see an decrease between 15 to 17, and prison sentences declined. And then when we get back into interpretability, how do we make that meaningful for folks? We created this table in the report below, clearance rates, APD crimes solved. In 2010, they were solving 1 in 4. In 2017, 1 in 7. You dig into some of the other areas within here, and for certain crimes, and the numbers were better, the numbers were worse. I remember the homicide clearance rate being particularly concerning. Specialty court graduates had gone down in kind. Conviction rates had gone down. So, you know, not only the processing, but the efficiency, so to speak. So again, you know, and this was at the start, we had a really well outlined research plan. We had really well-defined goals of what the legislature, the questions that they were asking that we wanted to answer, and had good benchmarks to go back in time to look at trends. So again, you know, I think that there's just a lot that's possible. It's not necessarily limited by the tools that you have or might not have at hand.
All right, thank you. I know you've been busy with the legislative session, and John, we do appreciate you taking the time to present this great material. And I do want to make a plug for the next April 7th. We will have another webinar that will be presented by Derek Chin, and that is how CJCCs apply for crime reduction grants. So don't miss that one. All right. Well, thank you, John. I think we're out of time. And I do want to thank all of our participants also. We will get the slides up on the website as soon as possible.
Great. Thanks, Sherry, and thanks for the invite to Sherry and Linda, and thanks to everybody. Happy data collection.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Great. We'll see you.
Bye.